Great. Tiaan, are
Thanks,
you?
thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Tiaan, are you here with us?
I am low, yes.
Great, guys. We're so lucky to have Tiaan Smith, who's the transaction director at Benchmark International, here with us today. Benchmark is one of the best outfits out there in terms of preparing a company for sale. They're experts in the exit process. So for all of the founders who are building a company that they ultimately want to sell for a really good valuation, Tiaan and the Benchmark guys are your people to speak to. We've asked Tiaan, how do you build to ultimately be able to sell? So Tiaan, over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Lo, and much appreciated. Really, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of your event this year. Really enjoyed listening to all the speakers up to this point. Maybe just as a brief introduction, as Lo had mentioned, I work at Benchmark International. We essentially are global sell-side advisors with our head offices actually sitting in Tampa, Florida in the US. And then we've got a presence in the UK as well as in Ireland, and then more recently in Germany and Europe, and then of course in South Africa as well. So how to build a business for sale is such a relevant topic, one that would probably be nearly impossible to cover in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try my best. And as most of the discussions today was focused on early stages of business, I'm really glad to see that one of the topics deal with exiting of a business. And as many people understandably so focus on their journey through a company and often fail to discuss how they plan to leave and exit. I hope that some of these points I touched on will be relevant to the listeners tonight. So questions that I believe that a business owner should ask themselves probably more often is, when the time comes to sell the company, what will make it attractive to buyers or acquirers? How can they be sure to obviously obtain a fair price, and what can they do to actually prepare for sale, and how long that process takes? Now, considering the speakers and the listeners or the audience this evening, I've got absolutely no doubt that there are individuals that are way better placed and more experienced in building businesses than myself. So I want to frame the topic slightly differently, and I hope you don't mind, in focusing on exiting a business, but I want to do that through focusing also through the lens of a potential acquirer. And every entrepreneur exits eventually. It's one of the few absolute certainties in business. Assuming you've built a viable company and a good asset, you would ultimately be in the driving seat in terms of choosing when you want to exit. Now, as global sell-side advisors, we have the privilege and the honor to deal with entrepreneurs and business owners, as well as a broad range of acquirers, locally as well as internationally, on a daily basis. And therefore, really understanding what makes businesses more attractive, what are the main obstacles that get in the way during a sale of a business, and then also typically what influences not only the price and valuation of a transaction, but when the time actually comes to exit, as well as what the probability is of concluding a successful transaction. Now, perhaps to position the discussion, I would like to encourage the listeners to not only think of exiting a business as an event, a once-off event, but instead of thinking of it more of a phase of the business, just like a startup is a period or a phase of the business. There are many factors that obviously affect how successful your exit will ultimately be. And I'm going to try and touch on a few points that would hopefully assist some of the business owners or entrepreneurs on this platform in their thought process as they enter that phase of the business. And again, unfortunately, due to the time constraint, there are a number of other points that are also relatively important. I would, however, like to touch on four, and these topics form part of all discussions that we have on pretty much a daily basis when business owners are looking to exit, and it undoubtedly affects the value or the probability of successful concluding a transaction. So the 4 points is, how do you remove over dependence in various areas, which I'll touch on a few points under that. How to create a sustainable competitive advantage. In other words, what makes your asset obviously more attractive. How to build recurring revenues and sustainable growth and earnings, and really focusing on that, which any acquirer is interested in hearing. And then obviously establishing strong systems and really focusing on keeping good financial records, which I'll touch on and is also a point of discussion in pretty much every meeting we've got with any acquirer. So firstly, how to remove overdependence. And under overdependence, there's a few things I want to touch on. And the first one is overdependence on the actual founder or the owner. And we often hear this. I'm sure any entrepreneur that has gone through a first finance round has heard around the founder at that point in time. Maybe in the beginning it's slightly different, really being dependent the business on the founder and the owner. And as you continue down the journey and the business gets more mature, is often what the founder or the owner, the mistake they make is they kind of become synonymous with the company. And although remaining at the center of the business, can be understandable at an early stage of the business, it really causes a host of growth barriers and some big roadblocks between you and a fair price when you really decide to exit. Any acquiring company wants to see that there's a management layer in place and that the management team has some sort of a long-term incentive plan that will really encourage them to stay after the business is acquired. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that incentive needs to be in the shape of equity. It can be in shape of incentive schemes. It's just important that there's some sort of alignment between the management team as well as the particular acquirer that you might have attracted. The second point under overdependence is customer overdependence. I'm sure everyone that's gone through a finance round as well is there's a very heavy reliance on what does the customer concentration risk look like. And relying too heavily on one client or customer is risky and will definitely turn off certain potential acquirers. So typically the rule of thumb when we deal with exits, it's to ensure that a client doesn't make out more than say 10 or 15% of contribution to revenue. Understandable when a business starts off, beggars can't be choosers. You're not going to show business away. So again, slightly different early stages of a business, but certainly from a risk perspective is really to try and throughout the journey is to diversify your revenue streams and really minimize your customer risk or concentration. Thirdly, supplier concentration or supplier overdependence, shall I say. Often everyone looks at concentration risk from a customer perspective, but kind of neglect the supplier overdependence. And we've had a few instances over the last 6 months, 12 months, where this has actually become a real issue in the final stages of a transaction, where at some point in time, especially during COVID is a good example, where a lot of the customers or clients or the shareholders were reliant on international importers bringing in product or raw materials. They didn't have an alternative supplier. And what that left them with is obviously less leverage, having to increase the cost of sales, pressure on margins, profitability decreases. And again, I'll speak to sustainability of earnings in a bit, and ultimately driving the price or the value of the business down. So definitely something to keep in mind. And then lastly, employee overdependence, as your business relies on where your business relies on a very small handful of employees. Now, a common theme, and I'm sure most of you will agree with this, but a common theme that I've heard for a long time now is that good people are hard to find. And so often what happens is that when a company finds a good candidate, they understandably tend to place over-reliance on that individual or individuals, which in itself poses a risk. The second point I wanted to touch on is something that's also all too familiar for any entrepreneur, is finding a sustainable competitive advantage. And most potential acquirers we deal with look at hundreds of opportunities a year, if not a couple of hundred a year. And fortunately for them, they can do this, and they only have to select, perhaps depending on their appetite or capacity, 2 or 3 of those opportunities. So this is why it's extremely important to, again, through the journey and the phase of the business, to try and really figure out what makes your assets more attractive than the alternative for the acquirer, or what makes your assets more attractive for the acquirer. What is that black box and what's the magic behind your business? And if your business has a sustainable competitive advantage, it will be difficult. It will be costly for competitors to emulate your business and to take market share. What we often see, and we always try and share this with our clients and shareholders up front, is that when an acquirer looks at a business, they don't necessarily only look at valuing a business on the financial statements or valuing it on the balance sheet. They really do look at it from a strategic perspective in terms of what is their best alternative in terms of acquiring a business. If they don't acquire your business, what else is out there? So if you understand what your sustainable competitive advantage is, you definitely have a lot of leverage when it comes to those kind of discussions. Thirdly, recurring revenue streams or sustainable earnings or growth. It is no secret, obviously, recurring revenue models are extremely appealing to investors for a number of reasons. We've probably seen more of that over the last 12 to 24 months as we are also taking on more companies with these type of business models or revenue models, specifically from software development or software-based businesses and tech-based businesses, mainly due to the predictability of the cash flows. It contributes to scalability. With positive, predictable cash flow, you are also obviously able to push cash back in the business with less risk and being able to predict it. And then probably the most powerful of the key benefits is the customers you acquire and that relationship that you build over time. And that speaks to the sustainability of the earnings, which we find is really a point of focus over the last 12 months for any acquirer. And then often this isn't probably worth mentioning is that this sustainability of earnings is often tied to the structure or the construct of a deal when the time comes to exit. A very simple example would be is if the sustainability of the earnings cannot be justified or confirmed at the stage of closing, typically you would find some kind of an earn-out structure or deferred element to it, really just to mitigate the risk from the acquirer's perspective. And we see this in all kinds of transactions, all shapes and forms. Again, if all of this is in order and you can really show that you've got recurring revenue streams as well as prove your sustainable earnings, then hopefully this would become less of an issue and you can focus on achieving a higher payout on closing. And then maybe as a last point, establishing strong systems. And I'm going to include keeping good financial records. Lo, I'm sure you can attest to this, but I'm going to include this under this topic. Businesses that are built on good processes are simpler to run or easier to run. They're typically more profitable and they're certainly more attractive to acquirers as it, again, it poses less risk to an acquirer. And ultimately what you want for your business is for the systems to run the business, the people to run the systems, and then for you to lead the people. And with regarding to keeping good financial records, especially dealing with the larger companies, the listed companies and the international acquirers, what we often find is that the clients or the companies that we assist with or facilitate the exit, when their financials or their record keeping is not up to scratch, it could very often be the culprit of either deals falling over or deals being delayed for a significant amount of time, really losing momentum throughout the DD process. What I'm not suggesting is that you, as a founder or owner-run business, cannot run personal expenses through it. There's ways to obviously normalize that and to reflect it or to get to a true reflection of the financial records. But what I am suggesting is that when you do run personal expenses through the business, or when you do have some add backs to take into consideration that's justifiable, is just to keep the record and to keep the source documents to that information, which would make it so much easier when you actually get to that point in time when you are dealing with the financials and the due diligence. And then perhaps in closing, I'll touch on the $1 million question, and that is, when is the right time to sell? Now, we often hear the saying, willing buyer, willing seller, and something that I certainly believe is overlooked, and we see it more often than not, is the element of timing. Now, I almost want to use the same analogy that Matt used earlier this evening in the talk, where he said that investors partaking in a finance round, it's like being at a cocktail party and someone comes around with a tray of snacks, and you actually don't know when they will come around again. So you better take some snacks when they're next to you. And the same goes for acquirers. We have closed transactions where acquirers looked at a specific transaction 3 years ago, and the business didn't change significantly in 3 years, but back then the timing wasn't right for whatever reason. And a couple of years later, we've successfully closed that transaction with exactly the same retailer in this example. So never underestimate timing. And my advice would be is to always be on market. Acquirer strategy changes with time, and more importantly, so do their priorities. So don't make any assumptions on whether there would be interest or not interest. And I would encourage you to have the discussions and really let the market speak for itself in terms of whether there's interest and not interest.
Sure,
Thanks,
Tiaan.
Leo.
Wow, thank you very much. That's such a good structure that you've just unpacked for us. I think, everyone that's thinking about, building a company that they ultimately want to sell can definitely gather a lot of golden nuggets from there. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Leo.